Last year, Australians made a clear decision rejecting a proposal for a Makarrata, or truth-telling commission, one of the components tied to the voice to Parliament. Now, let's be clear, Australians aren't afraid to hear the truth about our history, but many felt that what they get wouldn't be the full story, especially from those who've turned Aboriginality into a cause and are determined to cast the past in the darkest possible light. We wouldn't hear about many things our ancestors got right, that's for sure. The noble and enlightened aims of many of the early settlers, the abolition of slavery, or the opportunity convicts were given to redeem themselves. Nor would we hear about how Aboriginal people were considered equal before the law from the very start of settlement. During the intense debate preceding the referendum, I found myself reading a book by my next guest, Nigel Biggar. The book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, is a nuanced history of the British Empire that takes into account both the achievements and the failures. It's a history told in three dimensions, in other words, by somebody who has a steady and thoughtful moral compass. Nigel Biggar is the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology and the Director of the MacDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life at the University of Oxford. And he's here in Australia as a guest of Quadrant magazine, giving a series of talks and discussions across the country, starting with a dinner here in Sydney next Monday, and I'll have details of that shortly. Welcome to Reality Bites, Nigel.
Thanks, Nick. I'm glad to be back on the show.
First, let's turn to empire. I mean, the idea of empire is at least 2,500 years old, I guess, beginning with the Persian Empire, perhaps even before that. We've had the Ottoman Empire, we had the Qing dynasty, we've had the Khmer Empire, we've had the Aztec Empire, on it goes. Why are the anti-colonialists so fixated on just one form of empire, the European Empire, and in particular the British Empire?
Nick, you're quite right. That is their extraordinary focus, and the fact that they don't seem to care about non-white empires needs thinking about. So my perception is that the British Empire in particular is a proxy for the West. And historically, of course, the British Empire was the leading, as it were, proponent of Western civilization from about 1815 till just before the Second World War. And then the British Empire was overtaken by the United States. And it's under the United States' aegis that we have been living since the Second World War. So I understand the relentless critique of the British Empire as an attack on the record of the West.
Yeah, well, as you say in the book, the war against the empire is not really a war against the past. It's a war about the future. How so?
You know, I first thought that back in Oxford in 2015-16 when outside of Oriel College in Oxford there were protests hollering for the dismantling of a statue of the late 19th century entrepreneur and imperialist Cecil Rhodes. And I noticed here we had several hundred extremely privileged Oxford postgraduate students hollering for the dismantling of a statue to a long-dead British imperialist. Meanwhile, in South Africa, where Rhodes did his business and spent his life, Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, was busy looting the South African state and feathering the nest of his kith and kin. And these privileged Oxford students didn't seem to care about South Africa in real time. They were spending their time hollering for the dismantling of a statue of a long-dead imperialist. And that made me begin to wonder what the protesting students really cared about. It wasn't really the present. I mean, it wasn't really the past at all. It was the present. They were using or abusing history for present political purposes.
And quite ruthless and unprincipled in the way they do it. I mean, in the case of Cecil Rhodes, you quote how he was grievously misquoted. Things they make up things basically about him to turn him into this evil figure that he clearly was not. You know, why do they get away with this? Why can't we simply correct the truth and be done with it?
Well, I've tried to correct the truth about that on several occasions, and I noticed that the people concerned just don't care because they don't really care about the truth about the past. They care to use a caricature of the past, as I say, for present political purposes. What might those purposes be? In some cases, it's career. One of the leaders of the Rose Must Fall campaign was a young South African who was in Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, mind you, getting a postgraduate degree in law, and he went back to South Africa to play a part in radical black politics in South Africa. So his involvement in the Rhodes protest in Oxford got him lots of notoriety and lots of attention and publicity, and it served his career. It didn't do anything at all for the people of South Africa.
One of the things you do, I think, with scrupulous fairness is go through and it's almost a cost-benefit analysis, if you like, of empire. You weigh up the good and the bad, and you look at the intentions and the motives of many of the people who were responsible for founding colonies around the world, including here in Australia, where, as we know, I mean, this was a very different sort of colony. It was a post-Enlightenment colony, founded on the back of the anti-slavery movement, and many of the people involved, many of the leading lights in the colonial exercise here, were very much enlightened figures, weren't they, who came out with the very highest intentions.
Yes, and I think we can't judge morally the actions of people simply by their outcomes, because oftentimes with the best of intentions, and with all sorts of prudent calculations, we all know that sometimes things go belly up and pear-shaped, and we couldn't help it. We did our best. We intended the best, and we sought to do the best, but things are often out of our control. So, for example, in both North America and in Australia, one of the most destructive effects of British and European colonisation was the communication of disease, against which native peoples, both in Australia and North America, were not immune. And that was devastating, but no one intended to do it. It was inadvertent. In the same way that merchants brought bubonic plague to Europe in the 14th century, which decimated, some people say, a third or half of the population of parts of Europe. Again, no one intended it. It was really tragic. So the word tragic elements in British colonisation in Australia, especially in the case of disease, but the likes of Arthur Phillip, who led the first fleet, and the likes of Lachlan Macquarie, who was governor of New South Wales, they were very admirable people with admirable intentions, both toward convicts and toward indigenous people they found here. And their aim was, as far as indigenous people was concerned, was to first of all to make peace with them, and secondly to incorporate them or assimilate them into British society. The only alternatives to assimilation are annihilation or apartheid, and British imperial policy was never about annihilation or apartheid. It was about incorporating these peoples into the new world that was enveloping them, and there was no alternative.
Well, yeah, and of course, there's a long history of people romancing the primitive, if you like, the noble savage idea, the idea, glossing over the fact that, you know, a hunter-gatherer society with tribes at war with one another, clans at war with one another, was, you know, nasty, brutish. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. You know, whatever came in the form of diseases, the overall benefit of bringing modernity to a continent like Australia is that everybody lives very much longer, even though we do have a problem with Aboriginal life expectancy not being as high as non-Aboriginal. Life is surely better in the modern world than it was in the former life as a hunter-gatherer, isn't it? Yes,
of course, and I'm not shy of. I mean, I will refer to the culture of Aboriginal people in Australia in the 1780s as Stone Age, and by that I don't mean to say that Aboriginal people were stupid. They weren't. They had learnt to adapt to their environment in remarkable ways, and Stone Age human beings could be remarkably inventive. I went to a museum in Copenhagen in Denmark a few years ago, and I discovered glass cases full of prehistoric skulls. These were people who died 4,000 years ago. And in the skulls, there were perfectly round incisions where bone had been lifted off the skull. Why? Because in prehistoric times, right-handed prehistoric warriors would hit an enemy on the head on the left-hand side and impact the skull, press on the brain. Prehistoric Stone Age people learnt to cut open the skull in order to release pressure in the brain and save the warrior. In other words, prehistoric people, Stone Age people, had learnt the art of trepanning, surgical trepanning. Now, they weren't stupid, and Aboriginal people weren't stupid, but in terms of technological development, they were very primitive. And you're right. And to say that they were primitive technologically doesn't mean there was nothing interesting or significant or beautiful about their culture. But one has to be realistic about this. The lives of hunter-gatherers was very insecure because food supplies were insecure. And one reason why sometimes Aborigines approached the British settlement in Sydney and walked the streets and hung around was because the food supply was more secure. Yes, indeed, the impact of colonization was sometimes very shocking to Aboriginal peoples, but the fact of the matter is that the world was coming to Aboriginal Australia one way or another sooner or later, and it could have been much worse.
Well, you came at this topic not as a historian, not as a professional historian as such, but as an ethicist. And as somebody, this is your first visit to Australia, I guess you were less than familiar with Australian history before this project, which is why I think what you've done in looking at the two conflicting accounts of settlement, of first contact between the historian Keith Windschuttle and his nemesis Henry Reynolds, and weighing up the evidence of the two. I wasn't quite sure which way you were going to go, but at the end I was rather delighted that you came down on the side of Keith Windschuttle, the former editor of Quadrant and a good friend of mine. But because, this was not in the end, I guess it comes down to the question of genocide, really. Was genocide or anything like genocide committed in this country by white settlers, or were there isolated and sporadic incidents of violence and so forth, which we wish could have been avoided, but it wasn't systematic? Is that essentially the question you looked at?
Yes, I mean, Windschuttle's dispute with Henry Reynolds was and other historians was over the numbers of Aborigines who were reckoned to have been killed by settlers, and Windschuttle thought that Reynolds and others were exaggerating, and I wasn't sure how I was going to come out at the end. But I did think that a lot of Windschuttle's arguments were cogent, and I noticed other historians like Geoffrey Blainey and even the left-wing historian Stuart McIntyre think that Windschuttle was right on that. So one issue is that the number of Aborigines killed, but much more important is whether there was what's loosely called genocide in Tasmania. I think Robert Hughes, in his famous book in the 1980s, The Fatal Shore, says this was the only genocide in the British Empire. And I consider that, and everything hangs, of course, on what you mean by genocide. If you mean lots of people died, well, yes, there was genocide, but then that's too loose a definition. The international legal definition of genocide is it is an intentional, systematic attempt to exterminate a people. And there may have been some settlers in Tasmania who were so hostile to Aborigines that they wanted them all dead. But the colonial government did not want them all dead. It sought to protect Aborigines against settlers. And Windschuttle argues, I think, again, convincingly, that those settlers who were exterminationist in intent were a minority, not a majority. So I think Windschuttle wins that, and actually Henry Reynolds, who tends to be an opponent of Windschuttle, actually agrees that it is not appropriate to describe the tragedy that befell the Aborigines in Tasmania as a genocide.
Nonetheless, that seems to be an idée fixe amongst the chattering classes that it was genocide. It seems hard to be able to shift that narrative, and we're now in this world where every year, in the run up to January 26th, Australia Day, there's calls for that to be scrapped because it's hurtful to Aboriginal people and so forth. What damage is it doing to a country like Australia when we can no longer unite to celebrate our national day, and that indeed the interpretation of our history, whether good or bad or indifferent, is disputed?
I think there's enormous damage because what it's doing, Nick, is calling into question the legitimacy of the state from its very beginnings. It's like the 1619 Project in the United States that wants to say that America didn't begin with the Declaration of Independence. It began with racist slavery. That was the foundation of the state. And in my own country, in Britain, what does it do to national self-confidence if you really believe that 400 years of British engagement with the world through the British Empire, stretching from Newfoundland to New Zealand, was nothing but a litany of racism, oppression, and exploitation? Who would want to believe in Britain if that's what you really thought? So I think it's very damaging. And I think you're right, it's difficult to shift this narrative, not because people are well informed or because they are convinced. Most people, I think, simply want to follow the fashion or the trend because they're scared of being seen to dissent. The good news is, I think, if more people dare to question the narrative, and my examination of the British Empire, and in particular of Australian history, persuades me that a more nuanced narrative is the true narrative. If people have more confidence to question this black armband version of Australian history, this relentlessly negative version, then others will gather courage. And I think the whole shaky facade of the decolonising narrative will collapse quite quickly.
Well, you tell the story in the book of how the pylon started when people latched onto the fact that you were challenging the conventional wisdom in academic circles on colonialism. Tell me a bit about that and where that's led you personally.
Yeah, so what happened was I picked up that colonial history was being abused for political purposes I regarded as destructive in Britain, particularly part of the argument for the disintegration of the UK through Scottish independence. And so in 2017 I hooked up with a very eminent historian of empire, both British and global empire, John Darwin, and we launched a project in July 17 called Ethics and Empire, and we simply wanted to look at empire from ancient China to the modern period, and to consider what ancient Chinese people thought about the empires of their day, what medieval Muslims thought of Arab empires of their day. And this was going to run over 5 years with annual conferences. And then in late November 17, I published an article in the London Times arguing what I thought then to be the completely incontrovertible case that the British Empire gives Britons and Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders cause for both pride and shame, both shame and pride. Who could argue with that, thought I. And then about a week later I put up on the website of the Ethics and Empire Project a description of the project. And that's when a week later Prem Gopal, who was then reader in post-colonial literature at the University of Cambridge, tweeted her post-colonial colleagues in Oxford, and the tweet ran, OMG, oh my God, this is serious SHIT, we need to, block capitals, shut this down. She was referring to the Ethics and Empire project. And then shortly after that, in the space of a week, there were 3 online denunciations of the project, the second coming from 60 Oxford colleagues, and the third from about 200 academics worldwide, calling for Oxford University to take the project out of my hands. And that was a real shock, because I had no idea it was coming. I'd never experienced, as an academic, I have experienced criticism from colleagues. I'd never experienced this kind of online mobbing, even from colleagues in my own college and across the road from me in the next college. So it was really quite unnerving.
What did it do to you personally to be in that position?
Well, made me very worried. I discovered that close friends of mine who didn't like conflict decided to step away from me because I had become a magnet for conflict. So not only did I have aggressive strangers hollering for, calling me an idiot and perverse and calling for my project to be dismantled, I had friends stepping away from me. I had lots of colleagues who said nothing, just treated me with silence. All very, very unnerving. But I had friends who encouraged me to stay the course, and I was convinced that I was right. Not as convinced as I am now, but I was convinced I was right and I wasn't daft. And then what I found was really encouraging. I found, notwithstanding all the hostility from university colleagues, the press, the centrist press, the centre-right press, was supportive. People writing into the letters pages of the Times newspaper in London, overwhelmingly supportive. Some academics wrote in support. And the other interesting thing was, Nick, that I discovered that there are people in Britain with non-white skins, ethnic Indians, ethnic Iranis, ethnic Africans, who agree with me. I didn't know that before. In particular, one consultant physician of Indian ethnicity, whom I met 10 years ago, emailed me and said, Nigel, you probably don't know that my grandfather was in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar in April 1919, when General Dyer infamously opened fire on an unarmed crowd, killing several hundred. He was in there. But, said Raj, I still agree with you. I think the British Empire contained good things as well as bad. In addition to being unnerved, I learnt an awful lot, Nick, and I learnt actually that out there in the wider public, lots of people are much more sensible than many of my academic colleagues, and they include people who are not white.
Just to bring things up to date, I mean, I read your book, as I said, during the debate on the voice referendum. 1 week before the voice referendum, October 7th, 2023, was a very dark day, as we know, the most brutal slaughter of Israeli people since the Holocaust. The reaction to that from people who would call themselves enlightened and intelligent progressives has chilled me to the bone. Well, they seem to have built into their critique, very central to their critique, is anti-colonialism, isn't it? The idea that Israel is a colonial project and that the Jews, if not white, are certainly white adjacent, as they like to say.
Yeah.
It's absurd on one level, isn't it? Perhaps you'd like to tell me how absurd it is and how dangerous it is to start thinking in those terms.
Yeah, so the anti-colonialist narrative is a melodrama. It's got villains and victims. It's got black and white. Excuse me, white and black in this case. It's oppressive settlers versus oppressed indigenous peoples. And it's very stark. It's very simplistic, and it's dangerous because if white or Jewish settlers are simply wicked and oppressive, then if they're simply wicked and oppressive, that licenses violence with no holds barred. And so I noticed there was a lecturer in law at one of our universities in Britain, the University of Kent, who tweeted after October the 7th that the Hamas and the Palestinian people had a right to fight Israeli oppression by all means available. And this was after October the 7th, so she seemed to be saying that she thought that Israeli settler oppression was such that the totally indiscriminate and sadistic killings that Hamas perpetrated on October the 7th were justified. And I found elsewhere that she had described Israel as a case of settler colonialism. So yes, this melodramatic narrative in this case clearly legitimated the use of indiscriminate, unscrupulous violence. So it's not just historically wrong, and I can explain why it's historically wrong, but also dangerous because it takes all the constraints off violence. Now, just as to why it makes no historical sense, this is the truth about the creation of the State of Israel. Before the First World War, the land of Palestine was a province in the Ottoman Empire. Jewish bodies, Zionist bodies, bought land in the Ottoman province of Palestine for Jews to settle on, which they did. They bought land, didn't seize it, they bought it from Arab landlords. And then after the First World War, the British were given a mandate to govern Palestine until such time as a Jewish homeland could be established. And up until the British exited after the Second World War in 1948, Zionist settlers only occupied 10% of the land, 10%, which had been purchased, not invaded. But then after the UN acknowledged Israel as a state in 1948, Arab countries decided to invade to crush the nascent Israeli state. In the course of that war, 750,000 Arabs fled land in Palestine. Some of them, it seems, were expelled by Zionists. Many of them fled. But equally, 900,000 Jews were expelled from or fled from other Middle Eastern countries into the land of Israel. So the way in which the Zionists came to occupy large parts of Palestine was partly through the purchase of land, partly through war in which Arabs had fled, and it wasn't through invasion. To talk about that being an invasion is far too simplistic and doesn't get anywhere near doing justice to the complex, messy historical truth. So this decolonizing narrative is not only dangerous; it's just historically nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, as Emmanuel Macron said, and I'm fond of quoting him on this one, you're free to criticise our history, but first you have to know it. Thank you very much for your book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, which is a great way to start learning a lot about Australian history, which isn't taught in schools these days, and indeed the history of the British Empire more generally. Thank you for joining us on Reality Bites. We hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Nick. This is a really important topic. I'm really glad to have a chance to discuss it with you.
Nigel Biggar is a very brave and important voice in this debate, and you won't want to miss him if you get a chance to see him speak here in Australia. First of all, he'll be speaking on Monday, this coming Monday, October the 21st, in Sydney at a dinner held by Quadrant between 6 and 9 p.m. at Daltone House Hyde Park. He'll be appearing with Keith Windshuttle and Margaret Cameron Ash, two eminent Australian historians, to talk about Australia's history and its achievements. Go to quadrant.org.au for that, or you'll see on your screen a QR code. If you maybe just freeze the screen for a moment, you can take a picture of that and go straight through the website. There's still a few tickets left for that, but hurry, because It's only a couple of days away as I record this. The second event is in Melbourne. That's on October the 29th, Tuesday, October the 29th, from 5 o'clock to 9:30. This event's in two parts, by the way. There'll be, first of all, a drinks and canapes section where the main debate will be held, and then there's an optional dinner afterwards if you want to have further conversation with Nigel Biggar. And his guests there will be Keith Windschuttle, Australia's greatest living historian, and Geoffrey Blainey. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Both of them eminent historians. Keith Windschuttle is a marvellous historian, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind you saying that Geoffrey Blainey is Australia's most eminent living Australian historian, and he'll be there too. So the three historians with Nigel Biggar, Keith Windschuttle and Geoffrey Blainey on Tuesday, October the 29th at the Windsor Hotel in Melbourne. And you can book it at quadrant.org.au or using the QR code on your screen.